For engineering tips today, we're going to talk about container files, specifically considerations for the design deliverables. I want to invite you to enter information into the chat if you have a question or a comment, or just unmute yourself and interrupt me as we go along. I do have a plan, and let me start at the top. I want to show you some files and explain first what they are. I have a list of files that I've been using for a couple of weeks now, and there are published geometry files, published corridor files, and then there's cross-section base, and I have a terrain published file. What I don't have in this data set yet is container files, so I'm going to make some today and show you an appropriate way to create container files, especially if you're using them as a deliverable for the design process. I did want to tell you, though, that there are a couple of other container files, civil container files, that have been in use for quite a while, but they don't have the CF in their name. The cross-section base is a container file, as well as that the OPNP file is considered a container file. The reason I consider these container files is because the default model for these files holds pretty much just reference attachments. That is what makes it in the classification of container files. It contains reference attachments to other data. Now I have some information on the EAST website that's already there in the EAST PDF list, and it is a document called Survey and Design Deliverables Container Files. I've got that document open because I want to explain a few things, and I didn't want to rewrite everything, but I will tell you that I am producing a step-by-step document that explains the steps behind how to create the container files. Because we haven't done that, we haven't posted anything like that on our website. We've allowed you to get that information from your training. So now we're going to go through a few more specifics, and we'll take a look at that. Let me just make sure that is set. Okay, let's see. The container files, if you open that up, you will see a slide. It's the 6th slide in the container files document, and it says that we've been using another type of container file for quite a while, and that's the CAD base file. So CAD technicians have used a container file. They used to call it a CAD base for references, and it was a way for them to assemble all of the reference attachments they might need to assemble a set of plans, and then they would use that container file and they would attach it to all their plans. So it's an easy way, because you only have to make one reference attachment. That was the nice thing. But we're going to talk about civil container files today. And the civil container files, the default model is 2D. There are typically few graphics that actually live in the container file. Typically, they mostly have a ton of references. So the idea is that you would reference attach to the container file, the default model, and toggle on your live nesting in order to see your actual published information. I've got a live nesting depths that I wanted to display before I get into the steps, and this just shows the master file as being the OPNP file, but I'm more interested in the container files themselves. If we treat the container file called geometry base or terrain e-base container file, if we treat those as the master file, then that means our published work is one level below the master file. And so you would live nest to a depth of 1 in order to see the actual information. I've got the steps written up to create a civil container file. These would be steps for a designer, and I said designer because it's typically designers who are using open roads or open site. So civil container files are created using those products. You would create a brand new file from a seed file, a 2D seed file. And you would edit that 2D seed file after you've put its name as container file, and you'd edit with your open roads or open site. You attach a terrain to the default model. You set the terrain as your active terrain model. That causes OpenSite and OpenRoads to create a default 3D model and do a self-reference attachment to that model. After we verify that our default 3D model was created, then we can detach the terrain. And I'm recommending that if you are creating a container file for a corridor or for a geometry, that you would want to detach the terrain so that it doesn't interfere with processes that are used to create contract plans or to do other design work. And I'll show you what those are. It's called redundant referencing, can come into play if we leave a container file or a terrain attached to a container file of a different type. So once I've used the terrain to create that 3D model, I can detach it. And I'll show you how to do that. So let's go into a demo. And in my demo, I'm going to run OpenRoads Designer. And I'm going to create a container file. Typically, the first container file that's created would be the survey terrain container file. But I'm going to act, my hat says designer on it today, so I'm going to act as a designer, and I'm going to create the geometry container file in my container files folder. Brand new file, make sure that it's 2D, and I'm going to give it a name, and I'm going to call it a geom_cf01 because I'm just a little bit lazy today. So this is my geometry container file. So a regular container file just has reference attachments, but a civil container file needs to have that 3D model. So the first thing that we're going to do in preparing this container file is we're going to get OpenRoads Designer to create that 3D model the way it likes to create them. I can't just create it for it. OpenRoads has to do it itself. And so what triggers that is attaching a terrain as a reference. The terrain that I happen to have handy in this data set is actually the published terrain file. Typically, you will have access to a terrain container file. The difference is in how you attach it. If you're attaching to a terrain container file, you're going to need to specify that you want to turn on live nesting so that you can see the actual published work. And to turn on live nesting, you can do it after you make the reference attachment, or you can change your attachment method to interactive and do it on the dialog as you are making the reference attachment. Since I have the published terrain, I'm just going to use coincident world and choose open. This makes a reference attachment to the default model. When I look at the references dialog, I can see that the model that's attached is the default model. My next step is to select the perimeter or a contour if that's what's displayed. You need to select some element that's coming from the terrain. So I'm going to select it, move my mouse away, and then hover back over the selected line to get the pop-up menu. And I'm going to choose Set as Active Terrain Model. Now, I said I was going to do that, but give me just a second. I want to just point out right now, there's only one model here. It's the default model. OpenRoads is going to do something magical when I use the command Set as Active Terrain Model. What it did is it created the default 3D model. So OpenRoads did that. Not only did it create the default 3D model, it made a self-reference attachment from the 2D to the 3D so that I can see whatever's there. Cool. So it's done that. Now, the terrain has done its job. So I can detach the terrain. What I have discovered is if I detach the terrain here from the default model, oftentimes the reference attachment to the 3D model that's actually in the 3D model is left behind. Let me show you what I mean. I've got a reference attachment here in the 2D model to the 3D, but also if I change models to the 3D model, and look at the, I'm just going to look at the graphics. I'm going to fit my view. There's information that's attached there. OpenRoads did this automatically. It made a reference attachment to the 3D stuff in the 3D model. If I detach this manually here, typically it will detach it in the default model as well. But so I would verify that this is here, it's done, it's created its reference attachment, and then I would just go ahead and detach it from the 3D model. Go ahead and detach it. And then go back to the 2D model. And you might notice in my reference dialog, I have the attachment to my own. It's a self-reference attachment to the 3D model, but the terrain is no longer attached. This is correct. Now I'm going to attach the rest of the actual civil data. I'm in a Geom CF, so what I want to attach is the geometry publish file. I only have one. I'm going to go ahead and just attach it coincident world. It's okay. And there it is. If it's doing its job, if OpenRoads is doing its job, I should also see this, the 3D part of it attached to the 3D model. So I'm going to change to the 3D model, and I see graphics there. And sure enough, it has made automatically a reference attachment to the 3D model. This is working correctly. Yay. And I'm just about done with my container file. If I had any other published work, I could attach it here. Maybe I needed to attach a feature file. I could attach that. Let's create a corridor container file. Let's see, and I will respond to a question. I see one that popped up. In the container file, will we always set the existing terrain as active? Or is there a scenario where we would set the proposed terrain as the active model? My answer is it doesn't matter what terrain you use for the active terrain when you're creating a container file. The terrain's job is to have that 3D stuff so that OpenRoads creates the 3D model and makes all the reference attachments automatically. Doesn't matter which terrain you use. Typically, we will use the existing terrain because that's the one that's created earliest in the design process. So I just use the existing terrain. Let's do another one. I'm going to create a brand new file, and it's going to be for a corridor container file. So I'll just copy the name, type CORR, so this is my corridor container file. I need to do the same thing. I need to attach an existing or a terrain, and I happen to have the existing terrain, so I'm going to attach it. There it is. I'm going to fit the view, select the perimeter, hover over the perimeter line, and set it as active. And I'm going to verify that it made the 3D model, go into the 3D model, and in the 3D model, yep, there's the 3D part of the terrain. I'm going to go ahead and detach. I'm going to detach this terrain because I'm working in a corridor container file. If I was a surveyor and I was creating a terrain container file, or maybe I'm a designer and I'm creating a finished grade container file for terrains, I would leave it attached, but I'm not. I will cross-contaminate things. If I leave this attached, I will make it more difficult for other people to use this. So I'm going to detach it from here. And then I'm going to go back to the default model, and I'm going to continue constructing my corridor container file by attaching my published corridors. I happen to have two of them. I'm going to select both of them, and I'm going to just click open, and this will attach these published files. Not only does it attach them here, I'm going to verify, I'm going to go into my 3D model and make sure both of those corridors are attached, and they are. They're attached in the 3D. Perfect. So that's the way I wanted to do it. Now, let's take a look at how other people use the design container files. CAD technicians will attach container files to use in developing their plan sets. In order to do that, they'll typically create a brand new file for their plans. And they'll edit that file. And then in that default model, they will interactively. Now, I have put interactively in bold italics because it's important to know that if you change the method from coincident world to interactive, you get to choose your nesting, whether or not you want no nesting or if you want live nesting. And what they will want is live nesting with a depth of 1. This can be changed after the fact, yes, but it's nice to be able to do it as you're making the reference attachment. Then in that default model, they'll just place their name boundaries and create their drawings, and they will control their level display, and everything will be wonderful, supposedly. Other designers will do something very, very similar. If you are performing, maybe you're a hydraulic designer and you are going to do a channel, but you're actually going to model in that file. Well, you need to create an ORD file to work in. So you'll start with your 2D, just like we did with creating a container file, and you will set that, you'll attach a terrain and you'll set it as an active model. One of the things that you can do is you could actually attach to the container file. But when you do that, if you attach to the container file just simply coincident world, you're not going to see the terrain. It's that whole depth thing. You'll need to turn on live nesting so that you see the published data, same as the CAD tech will need to do. Then you can set that terrain active. That will make the file usable for your design, and you can continue with your design work. So let's see how a CAD technician would do it if they were going to create a plan sheet. And I'm going to launch MicroStation. You know, I'm going to state, okay, I'm toying with whether or not to use MicroStation or ProjectWise. Open Roads, but it doesn't really matter. The referencing is the same. It doesn't matter if you're using Open Roads or MicroStation. The referencing is identical. So I'm going to create a brand new file just using MicroStation. And I'm going to go into the container files and I'm going to create a PL01. Just use my shortened name. And in this PL01, I need to attach some data so that I can place some name boundaries. So I'm going to open up the reference dialog and I'm going to attach container files. I'm going to attach, oh, I didn't make the terrain container file. You know what? We're going to stop and I'm going to quickly make the terrain container file because I want to use that to illustrate the problem that some CAD technicians have when we leave the terrain attached, when there are multiple attachments to the terrain. So I'll show you that. Let's get a new container file for the terrain. So I have to do the same thing. And I need to attach the published terrain, I'll set it active, and then I'll have a container file. One of the things I wanted to point out was that cross-section template that I have used, this cross-section base template file. I waited to make this template until after I had created the ORD managed model. So that doesn't just have simple reference attachments. It's actually an activated file. It's ready for cutting my cross-sections. All right, here we are. Going to attach my terrain, coincident world, and I'm going to select the perimeter, set it as active, and I'm actually done with my terrain container file. I need to verify it. Created the 3D model. That's awesome. I'm done with my terrain container file, so I actually have it, and I'm going to exit. Now, if I was CAD technician and I wanted to attach all of those container files. I'll reopen my PL01. I'm going to attach all of the container files, but because they are container files, I'm not going to see the data unless I use live nesting. So when we get to this attach reference dialog, you'll notice that the attachment method is set to coincident world. If I want to be able to set live nesting up as I am attaching, if I want to be able to choose which model to attach to, I have to change this attachment method to interactive. What that means is, oh, you want to see the next dialog. If it's not set to interactive, you don't see it. I'm going to go ahead and make a selection set with my control key of the 3 container files and choose open. And here's that dialog I was talking about. The only thing I need to make is to set live nesting depth of 1. This is why we put all the information in container files into the default model, because that's the one that's attached by default, and you don't have to change that. So I'll just sit here and click OK 3 times. They all come in live nesting set to 1. Let me dock this just so it's out of my road. If I fit my view, there's all my data. Now, I wanted to point out that when you have these reference attachments, everything looks great. Let me pin this open. It's going to show you what can happen sometimes when you have multiple reference attachments to a file that you might want to control the level display on. The file that gets controlled a lot is the existing terrain. Other files that get controlled a lot are like design civil data. They would need to control what is displayed. But the existing terrain is the one that's like everybody needs, and we might have multiple attachments to the terrain, and I want to show you what can happen if you have a multiple attachment to the terrain. This is the reason why I don't recommend leaving the published terrain attached to the corridor or the geometry, because it will make other attachments to the terrain not editable, and it's frustrating. Let me set this up to show you what it looks like to have what are called redundant references and how frustrating it could be to try to change the level display. I'm going to open up my level display dialog. I'm actually going to dock it on the left side so that I can, jeepers creepers, see it. I just needed to see it. Okay. Now, I'm going to make a brand new reference attachment, and this reference attachment is going to be a second reference attachment to the terrain. What I wanted to point out is that right now in the hierarchy, I can expand the terrain container file and I can see the existing published file. I can see it. I'm actually seeing also the 3D reference, which I don't need to see. And typically I would toggle that off, not a big deal. But I can see all of the, I can see the published data. And if I select the container file in the hierarchy, I can see the default model where that terrain is showing, and I can turn levels on and off. It's great. I can see it up here in the level display dialog because there is this reference hierarchy is showing up in the level display dialog. It's the same reference hierarchy. So an interesting thing happens to that hierarchy when there is a redundant reference. Let me just show you what that is. I'm going to make a brand new reference attachment to the terrain. I'm just going to make it to the terrain container file. I'm going to make an additional reference attachment to the terrain container file. And live nesting depth of 1 is what I want. I'm going to call this, though, second attachment. Logically, I'm going to name it second attachment so that I know I've attached it twice. And we see that logical name show up, second attachment. Now, everything looks just fine over here on the left-hand side. I see all these little pluses, but notice that the hierarchy right now in the level reference dialog looks slightly different than the hierarchy in the level display dialog. The level display dialog is not allowing me to expand that second attachment to make changes to the level display. When I choose this second attachment in the hierarchy, what we see on the right-hand side are what are known as ditto marks. Ditto, D-I-T-T-O. Those are ditto marks. It means I'm a duplicate. I'm a copy. So I'm redundant. That's the bottom line. I'm redundant. I just had a notice in Teams. I was trying to see what the notice was, and I couldn't get things out of the way. There is a question, are we defaulting to interactive? So the question is about referencing. Let me just take a sidebar here. When we open up the reference attachment dialog, it uses the same settings that I set earlier in this session. So earlier in this session where I had the PL1 opened, I made this change to interactive. So while I'm in this session, it's set to interactive. And also my live nesting is set to depth of 1. If I change that to no nesting, then as I continue making reference attachments, it'll be set to interactive, no nesting. So while I'm in this file, in this session, it remembers the last way I set up the reference dialogues. If I entirely close out of MicroStation and get back into it, it's reset to the defaults, and the default attachment method is coincident world. I cannot change that. So coincident world is usually very good for designers because typically a designer, you want to attach references to other civil data, and we're keeping all of the civil data in a model called default. We are told, just use the default model. Don't put things in named models, use default. So great for designers, but for our CAD techs, not so great. If you want to choose which model you're attached to, you'll need to change that to interactive. Or alternatively, you can change the model that you're attached to. You could say, I need to change this from the default model to some other model by opening up the attachment properties, and you can change the model from the models pick list. Now, of course, I don't have any other models in my container file. Oh, that's not true. I have a default 3D model. Yeah, I have a default 3D model. But I wouldn't want to make a direct reference attachment to the default 3D. But this is just showing you that if you wanted to change the model, if you made a reference attachment and it was coincident world, you didn't notice it, and you're going, where's my data? You can always open the attachment properties and pick a different model. So that's an option. All right, where were we? This ditto mark. This ditto mark that I'm seeing means that I can't control the level display. If I wanted to even more than, I can toggle the whole thing off. I can turn off the display of it. Nope, can't even turn off the display of it. I'm clicking and it's not turning off. So what I have done is prepared 2 ways that you can make these references no longer redundant. And that's probably what you'd want to do if this happened. The easiest way to make them not redundant is and the reason they are redundant is because they're the same. They have the same clip boundary and they have the same level display mask. They're exactly the same. So all we need to do to remove the redundancy is to change one thing about that second attachment, and it will no longer be redundant. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select that second attachment. I'm going to change its clip boundary. I am going to place a fence, and the fence is going to be a little bit bigger than the original boundary. That's okay. And I'm going to replace the fence. Use the active fence. It has done that. I got rid of the fence, get rid of the clip boundary. And so you'd think, oh, well, maybe I've gotten rid of the ditto marks. So I select that second attachment and I still see the ditto marks. Have no fear. I need to reopen the file. That's when it will be rescanned. So if I just reopen the file, a couple different ways to reopen the file. The easiest way is to type NE into the key-in window. That puts new file in there, and if I hit enter on the keyboard, it's going to reopen the file. It's reopened. If I select in the hierarchy on the left-hand side, the second attachment, I see now that the ditto marks are gone, and I actually see the little plus sign in my level display, which would allow me to choose different level display for that second attachment. I can set it up entirely differently than the first one. So we have to make them different somehow. The other way to make them different is to change something about the level display. That would probably have to be done in the first one because you can't control the level display in the second one. Then if it doesn't remove those ditto marks, just reopen the file. So I wanted to reiterate a couple of things and ask you if you have any questions. The thing I wanted to iterate is that as designers creating the container file that is the design deliverable, we can make life easier for other discipline designers and CAD technicians if we will not cross-contaminate our container files. So when we have those container files open, I'm going to close this. When we have those container files open, and I have a corridor container file open, for example, it's best to not see a reference attachment to a terrain. That would be best. Same thing with the geometry or the annotation container file. If I have those open, it would be best to not see the reference attachment to the terrain that we used to create that default 3D model. Anybody have any questions about that?
I have a question for you. This is
Yeah.
David McDonald. For drafting purposes and trying to get essentially contours or something to display a little bit differently, would we control that as well with creating our own terrain file and I guess modifying it versus using Survey's container file to do that?
Yes. I in a quick answer to that is yes. I have done a video in the past about how different disciplines can create their own. I think what you really want is like dumb graphics. Let's see, we've got display contours, elevation and profile. I think there was even other information. Example of contour display for an erosion control plan sheet. It looks like May of 2023. Yeah, I did some webinars. That's what I would recommend. Take a look at these webinars because you will just, it's a lesson in frustration to try to change the way contours display when they're coming from a terrain, because the contour is a calculated, I'm not even going to call it an element because it's not. It's a calculated thing, and it displays according to the feature definition on the terrain. If you want to be able to alter that display, it's easiest to follow the techniques that were outlined in these previous webinars. Here's a MicroStation terrain from an ORD civil terrain for a, what's that, contour base file. Here's the one you should look at, February of 2023. Yeah. Anybody else? Questions?
Lenny, Jeremy here from OTAC. Some of my team are having issues with the naming tool on ProjectWise. We're still.
Ah, okay.
Is there a link in your PDF list here, or is there a file that we need to receive to? Because it's still showing the full display windows and options. It's not dropping to the second to last page.
On your naming tool. So you're running ProjectWise?
Yes.
So yes, so there's a couple of things. And I typically would recommend that you talk with the ProjectWise administrators about this, but I do have a little insight for you. There is, it's an add-in that you would need to have actually installed for ProjectWise on your system to be able to correctly use the ODOT naming tool. So I think it's called the ODOT naming wizard. Let me just open up while we're here my control panel just so that you can see what it's called. And it's a separate thing. It's separate from ProjectWise, and it is called the ODOT naming wizard. So you would want to get that installed, and then the naming tool at least has a chance of working, right? So the other thing that you can do without having the naming wizard working is to go ahead and create your files without the wizard. And you could always use the attributes tab or
change it afterwards.
use the general tab to change it afterwards. And let me show you something that's in. So folks here at ODOT, Lenny is going to open up her ProjectWise locations, and I am going to go to the standards in ProjectWise Explorer. Let me show you what you might want to get, because this is available for consultants as well. Externals can access the ProjectWise standards folder. In the standards folder is a Excel spreadsheet called ProjectWise Document Naming Tool Search. Very handy, because if you know what you need to name it manually, I'm just going to open a copy that I happen to have on my machine. If you know what to name it, you can use the right-click rename and just name it. So I'm running that same file, and let's say I'm working for roadway, and I can just double-click here on the 120 across from roadway, and it opens up for me all of the different folders that roadway has names, and I can sort them by folders. And I could say, well, yeah, I'm looking in the number 6 civil data, and I'm trying to create a container file, and the diddly darn thing won't name it, but there's the name. So I know it has to have the R and the key number, CORR base CF, and a sequence number. And then Lenny always likes to have the .dgn. So if we look in the user training area, same area, in the key number 59s, there may be an example of what things should be named. So here I have a corridor base CF, and my sequence number is 50. Nobody says I have to start at 1, just saying. But I can use the right click to rename, and I make sure that that lock is locked, and the naming tool, even if it's running on a good day, it cannot put the .dgn, so I always put it there. If I change this to anything else, I always put the .dgn. And when I put the .dgn, see right now it's showing it's got a .dgn on the file name, but when I type it into the document name, when I type the last letter, it's going to resolve it. So now the document name exactly matches the file name, and I can click OK, and it's changed. So that's how you could use it. Of course, you would use it the other way around, and you would say, oh, this is supposed to be RK12345 CORR underscore CF underscore, that was probably 50, .dgn, because these are DGN files. I'm really particular. The document name should exactly match the file name. All right, does that answer that?
Yep, so I just need to contact the administrator to get that
Absolutely.
Add
I
in.
think it's ProjectWise admin at odot.oregon.gov. And they should be able to set you up with that naming tool add-in. Yeah.
Okay.
Cool beans. Thank you all for coming.